Lesson number 88 is about quadratic equations and solutions of quadratic equations by factoring. Now our first question says use the factor method to find the roots of the function. We have x squared minus 18 is equal to 3x. Now first off, to find the roots, that just means find the answers or the solutions. That means we want to solve the equation. We want to figure out what x is equal to in order to make the left side equal to the right side. Now, a quadratic equation, well, we've worked with quadratic equations before, we just haven't named them yet. A quadratic equation is anything that has x to the second power as the biggest power. 2 is always the biggest power in any quadratic equation. So in this problem, when we're using the factor method to find the roots of the function, what we have to do is set the equation equal to 0. So that's step 1. EQ is equation equal to 0. So set the equation equal to 0. So what we're going to do in order to do that is subtract 3x from both sides. So we're going to get x squared, and we're going to write it in descending order based on the variable, minus 3x minus 18 equals 0. Okay, we've got step 1. We've set the equation equal to 0. Step 2. Let's look at step 2. Step 2 is to factor. And when we factor the trinomial, what we're going to do is we're going to break this trinomial into two binomials. Now we know how to do this. We know we're going to multiply x times x to get to x squared. Then we have to find two things that multiply together to give us negative 18 and add together to give us negative 3. Well, this must be negative 6 and positive 3, because negative 6 times 3 is negative 18, and negative 6 plus 3 is negative 3. So this will work perfectly. Now step 3. Step 3 is the only actual new part of this process. And step 3 is to solve. And in order to solve the equation, it's equal to 0. So if either of these pieces equals 0, then the equation will be true. So let's say x minus 6, let's say that part is equal to 0. If that part were equal to 0, then the only way that could happen would be if x were to be equal to positive 6, because 6 minus 6 equals 0. Now, we can take the other part of our equation. If that were equal to 0, then the whole thing would be equal to 0 as well. So if we said x plus 3 equals 0, the only way that could work is if x is equal to negative 3, because negative 3 plus 3 equals 0. So we've got our two answers. X is equal to 6 and x is equal to negative 3. One neat thing about a quadratic equation is it's x to the second power. And when we have something to the second power, it tells us we're going to have two answers. So if we had something x to the fourth power, we'd have 4 answers. And it will just continue on like that. Let's go ahead and solve another problem. And we'll use this same process. We're going to set the equation equal to 0, we're going to factor, and solve. So we'll copy that. Okay, here we go. We want to find the roots of negative 25 is equal to negative 4x squared. So if we want to set the equation equal to 0, in this one, the only way we can set the equation equal to 0 and be able to solve it is to move the 4x squared to the other side by adding. And we're going to do that so we can use our difference of two squares theorem. So we're going to get 4x squared minus 25 equals 0. Okay, that was step 1. Then step 2, we're going to factor. So if we factor with step 2, we're going to have the whole thing and we're going to set it equal to 0. So the square root of 4x squared, that's going to be 2x. And remember in this we're going to have a plus and a minus. So we've got 2x again. The square root of 25 is 5. So we're going to get plus 5 and minus 5. Now in order to solve, step 3, we'll set each of these pieces equal to 0. So we're going to have 2x plus 5 equals 0. Because if this equals 0, then the whole equation equals 0, because if you multiply anything times 0, you get 0. And then we're going to take our second part, and we're going to set it equal to 0. So we're going to 2x minus 5 equals 0 for the second time. Now let's solve each of them. Here we're going to get 2x is equal to negative 5 because we subtract 5 on both sides. Then we divide by 2. So x must be equal to negative 5 halves. Or we could write negative 2.5 or negative 2.5. There's one answer. We know we're going to have two answers because this is a degree of 2. It's x to the second power. Now we're going to add 5 to our second equation. So 2x is going to equal 5. We'll divide by 2 and divide by 2 to get us x is equal to 5 over 2, or 2.5, or 2.5. So we've got our two answers. We set the equation equal to 0, we factored, and then we solved. Let's look at another example. Here we want to solve 3x squared minus 6x is equal to 9. So when we do this one, we'll use that same three-step process. This time I'll use the colors a little bit better than on the last slide. So step 1, set the equation equal to 0. So we're going to get 3x squared minus 6x, and then we're going to subtract 9, because we're doing the opposite here to move it to the opposite side of the equation. Minus 9 equals 0. We set the equation equal to 0. Step 2 is to factor. And this one has two parts to factor, because when we factor, we always have to factor out the greatest common factor first. So 3x squared, 6x, 9. Well, the only thing they have in common is a 3. So we're going to factor out a 3, and we're going to get 3x squared minus 3 times 2 is 6x, so minus 2x, minus 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. And the whole thing will equal 0. Now we're going to continue with step 2. It's a two-step process here because we have to factor our trinomial. So we're going to get 3, and we're going to break that down into two binomials. It's going to equal 0. So we're going to get an x and an x, because x times x is x squared. Then what multiplies to negative 3 and adds to negative 2? Well, that must be negative 3 and plus 1, because negative 3 times 1 is negative 3, and negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2. Now we're on to step 3. Step 3 is the solving part. It's really only the new part to this whole lesson. Now this time we have three binomials. And if we were to take this piece and put it in parentheses, we can never make 3 equal to 0. It just can't happen. 3 is not 0. But we could take the x minus 3 and make it equal to 0. And we could take the x plus 1 and make it equal to 0. And if either of these pieces equals 0, then the whole equation does. So when we solve these two pieces, we have found the roots of our quadratic equation. So for the first one, x must equal 3, because 3 minus 3 equals 0. And for the second one, x must equal negative 1, because negative 1 plus 1 equals 0. And we found our answer. I should say, we found our answers, because we have two of them. And that's exactly correct. And we know we should have two of them, because this has a degree of 2. It's x to the second power. Our lesson practice will be on page 370. Make sure you've got your notes complete, and I'll see you during our next class.